We're back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We've talked a little bit on this program, and I've written a little bit about the billionaire space flights that we saw from Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. And of course, Elon Musk has his own space programs. And I've talked in the past about how space exploration has been a source of, intended to be anyway, a source of national pride rather than corporate advancement. I've also talked on this program about the little known fact that before he was assassinated, John F. Kennedy thought it might be a good idea to change the U.S. space program by merging it with the Soviet space program. And that was a proposal he was actively working on that Lyndon Johnson killed. Imagine how differently we would view the concept of space exploration if that had taken place. My next guest has yet another fresh and interesting take on the whole issue of billionaires seeking to penetrate space, as it were. And I want to have her back on. I always enjoy speaking with her very much, and I appreciated her latest piece very much. Lynn Parramore is an author and cultural researcher. She has a recent piece at ineteconomics.org called headlined "Who Can Save Us from Jeff Bezos and Silicon Valley's Planetary Death Wish," and she joins us now. So first of all, Lynn Parramore, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
And likewise. Let's start with this. Obviously you cover a lot of territory in your piece, but one of the focal points that I found fresh and interesting was that it seems to me you really anchor your critique and your vision of an alternate way of looking at this process in feminism, and specifically in that branch of feminism known as ecofeminism. But tell us, from your perspective, what led you to write this piece, and what do you think, what do you know are your main themes for it?
It's always been interesting to me, the link between how we treat the environment and how we treat other human beings. And feminists have been really good at homing in on that link. Sort of starting in the 1960s, when there was a lot of societal upheaval going on, and increased interest in the environment and a sense of kind of impending environmental doom. And feminist writers began to approach the topic and notice that there's not only a link between imbalances in human societies and the way we treat the environment and environmental crises, but these things are also mutually reinforcing. So ecofeminism kind of became this diverse movement, and there are a lot of different perspectives and schools of thought. And unfortunately, there ended up being quite a bit of backlash to it. And by around 2010, it was kind of being dismissed. I mean, there were some practitioners and theorists who went off into more spiritual realms and things,
Right.
Academics didn't feel comfortable with, but the baby sort of got thrown out with the bathwater. And I had revisited some of the classics that ecofeminists had produced over the years and found a lot of really illuminating perspectives. And when I began to hear Silicon Valley tech billionaires express their attitude towards space travel, I got this ringing in my head. Wow, this is what these feminists were talking about. It's a kind of, the Silicon Valley guys would call it, a utopian vision. But actually, if you look at it from a feminist perspective, it sounds rather dystopian. You begin to hear people like Jeff Bezos talk about, we're going to destroy the earth anyway. We're going to run out of resources here. So let's just leave the earth behind. And maybe we could live in these oscillating cylindrical space tubes that are perfectly climate controlled and would sort of be on a path between Earth and Mars. Or others like Elon Musk, well, why don't we just colonize Mars? And in this vision, there are a lot of unanswered questions about how these societies, these colonies would work and who would be in charge of them. I suppose the tech billionaires themselves, who are rather anti-democratic and have not really devoted themselves to human well-being here on Earth. So that becomes kind of a dystopian vision. But there's something even darker going on. You hear people like, the Google founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, talk about their vision of quote unquote solving death. We're going to do that too. It's like we're going to have a total break with nature. We're going to leave our embodied selves behind. We're going to leave the earth behind, and that will save us. And I think that is a very dangerous fantasy. And the work of one ecofeminist in particular, Valerie Plumwood, who wrote this wonderful book in 1993 called Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. She talks about a mindset that goes all the way back to Plato in his Republic and some of his dialogues, where he kind of introduces this split between matter and cosmos, or the world of forms. And the world of matter is, of course, our embodied existence. It's the world where things decay and they die. I mean, it's a world of life, really. He associates that world with the feminine realm. And then on the other side, you have this, it's not exactly ideas, the world of forms. It's just total abstraction, a kind of reality where things are unchangeable, a kind of reality that has no embodied existence whatsoever. And he thought this was a higher realm, and he associated it with masculinity. And this initial kind of splitting of reality into these two parts and creating a hierarchy in which the unembodied reality is preferred creeps over into all kinds of Western thinking, going through the Enlightenment on up to capitalism. It kind of stuck with us. And so it leads to a kind of degradation of anything associated with matter, with the body, with the senses, with the life-giving properties of women's bodies and nature. And so you hear this echoed in what's coming out of these Silicon Valley tech billionaires who are almost invariably male.
Right.
It's like a teenage boy's fantasy of how to leave mommy behind and leave the body behind and have this wonderful adventure in outer space and conquer the body, conquer life itself. And I don't think that that's going to lead us anywhere good. That's sort of the overall take on where the launching point for me in that piece that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's such a rich topic. I mean, there's so much in it, and partially I was reminded of the Boy's Life magazines that used to come to me as a child, or in the '60s, that were always a young boy in a space helmet digging in the moon. That's who these guys are. But it also touches on so many issues of our culture. The belief in a difference, for example, between reason and emotion, right? The idea that women represent the emotion and men represent the reason, and it's all very well and good to be warm and sweet and cuddle a kitten or a child, but and that's the woman's job. But the men think the cold, hard thoughts, and it lifts and it bleeds into our politics, real politic. The notion that we are thinking the hard thoughts, that maybe we do need to nuke certain countries or destroy certain countries. We'll think the unthinkable. That all often, if not invariably, leading the thinkers down rabbit holes from into tragedies like the war in Iraq that are total disasters and failures, and yet they maintain this notion that they're rational and that there is this dichotomy, right, this split. And I think this philosophy is for one thing, obviously it's a cheap escape. It's a cheap out from the responsibility of all of us, especially billionaires, to preserve and protect this planet. But it is also, there is, as you may know, as I'm sure you know, an elaborate intellectual infrastructure behind it. I mean, there are philosophers like Nick Bostrom and others who say, we can digitize ourselves and launch ourselves into, microscopically small vehicles that, eventually come to ring the planet. And there are many trillions of living souls. And therefore, the logic is if you interfere with this grand vision of the future, it's as if you've killed a trillion beings with no thought of, well, but you're using so much power that you're destroying uh, the trees and the forestry and the vegetation in Virginia, for example, doesn't matter. And if you dare interfere, you're killing trillions of lives to save a tree. I mean, this is a deeply embedded consciousness and worldview. And I think, one of the reasons your piece was so important was because it's a clarion call that this is largely invisible to most people, but I have friends who know the greatly known tech billionaires, and privately they believe some very scary things, and they talk about some very scary things, and they think they're being rational, and people like you and I are nervous Nellies, basically. What do you think?
You know, this vision of the trillion people that could potentially live in these space tubes. Um, let's imagine that actually happened. What kind of life do they have? I mean, something as simple as the way we live in our bodies. We are creatures that eat, that sleep, that have sex. That we our existence apart from our embodied selves. There isn't any existence beyond that. And even something as simple as sleep. Our bodies sleep according to circadian rhythms. Our bodies developed patterns of sleeping according to the environment in which evolution prepared us for millions of years. And you can't just snap your fingers and wave that away and think that you're going to have healthy creatures who can just readily adapt to any old environment that's out there. I mean, that's just sort of one example. How are you going to have sex in atmospheres where there's or environments where gravity is different? I mean, just all kinds
It'll
of
be simulated. It'll be, and I mean, really, they believe this. And
right.
it'll be more vivid and more satisfying than anything you can imagine. And every human problem will be engineered out. But I even had this conversation with a friend of mine who is, would be considered a very progressive technologist, but he was saying, we should use virtual reality more. When you see a flower, a blade of grass, it can be so much more beautiful. I remember saying, but, I, as an organism, smelling or, looking at another organism has a beauty that is beyond the simulation, no matter how much you reproduce even the tactile sense. It's not the same thing. There is, and he accused me of a kind of mysticism, but I think it's a delusional belief. It's the same belief, they really think that having a robot pet is no different than having a living pet. They really don't understand that we know the biology and the neurobiology of what it means to have a pet on your lap or close to you, and how your pressure goes down, their blood pressure goes down. There's a bonding. They think, no, it would be fine to have a robot dog or cat is exactly the same. There's no difference. So, I mean, it feels to me like
or not only there's no difference, but it's preferable. You don't have to clean the litter box. There's no
right,
mess.
right. It's a kind of solipsistic psychosis to me, but these are enormously powerful people, and they're deeply committed to this view of the world, I think.
Yes, they are. And the alienation from the body and the sensory realm, which, again, the feminists are really good pointing out, by extension, everybody and everything that's kind of linked and associated to that realm. People from other cultures, people with darker skin are often associated with this realm of nature.
Right.
And the embodied realm, this integrated realm. But we train ourselves, our child rearing practices, our habitation practices, we train ourselves to be alienated from nature in very profound ways. And that's one thing that I've become increasingly aware of. The feminist scholar Dorothy Dinnerstein had a really interesting take on this in a 1970s book called The Minotaur and the Mermaid. And she talks about how just something as basic as Western child rearing practices, in which we tend to push the male out of the early child care experience. You know, we might talk about maternal leave in the workplace, but paternal leave has been a relatively, you know, sort of an afterthought. Oh, well, you know, men are considered secondary caregivers today in many workplaces. What does that mean to be a secondary caregiver? And often the women are considered the primary caregiver, but a secondary human being. So right from the outset, we are teaching children that women are supposed to be this endlessly giving resource, unpaid resource. And we also grow up perhaps resenting their omnipotence in our very early care. They're the ones that say, no, put that down, right, put your coat on, etc. And so we resent female authority. But we also just don't see men as nurturing, caregiving beings, and they don't see themselves that way often enough. Even though the rise of stay-at-home dads proves there are plenty of men who have wonderful caregiving capacities and are quite proud to use them. I mean, the way men are kept out of this realm by no means is helpful either to human, you know, equity or any kind of egalitarian social structure, but it's also, Dinnerstein argues, harmful to our environmental attitudes, because if you don't have a caring, nurturing role to play, a robust role to play in your family life, you may be less caring about your community, you may be less caring about the environment, about nature itself. So it's an alienation process that we bake in to right, our early child caregiving models that she argues is really destructive. And I think she has a good point there.
Yeah, it certainly feels like it. And you know, this may seem like a digression, but I hope it's not, Lynn Parramore, which is, you know, I was also thinking as I was reading your piece and thinking about ecofeminism that, you know, about the whole notion of difference feminism versus, you know, its counterpart, the kind of feminism that says that women have different qualities innately that should be celebrated and elevated because they're inadequately represented in our social structures, and the notion that women are inherently no different from men in these vital aspects of personality and skills. And I know I'm grossly oversimplifying, but and therefore our goal should be not to elevate the things we consider feminine, but to give everybody equal access to the power and structures we have. I mean, I don't know if I'm doing violence to the concepts as I try to describe them, but it feels as if it fits into this conversation somehow. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about women as inhabiting this more emotional and spiritual realm, I mean, we've set it up in
right,
a way that, you know, you go back to that Platonic split, that the masculine realm is the realm of the abstract, of forms and order, and then the feminine realm is this realm of nature and chaos, really, right, emotion. And so this is sort of baked into the way we think about everything, the way we think about dividing roles in the family, dividing roles in society, in the workplace, etc. Now, I wouldn't argue that men and women are exactly the same in every single aspect. We do have, you know, some differences in our embodied selves that are real and need to be taken into account. But we train men and boys out of their natural caregiving capacity. Right. I mean, there's a wonderful book also from the 1970s by Jean Liedloff called The Continuum Concept. She's a psychologist who studied a tribe in the Amazon. And fathers were regularly picking up their babies and young and, you know, carrying them around, carrying them on their back, etc. There wasn't this this attitude that men somehow should inhabit something separate, and that early child care was solely a female responsibility. So it's not a natural setup, necessarily, because obviously there are other cultures where this is not the setup. So we do something artificial that reinforces patriarchal values, which sort of elevate the rational male subject, and it's usually the white male subject, at the expense of anything or anyone else. And these attitudes coming out of Silicon Valley, they track very closely to that model. It's what's good for tech billionaires. It's not really what's good for everybody else. And again, it's a dangerous fantasy, because I don't believe that we are going to leave our bodies behind.
Right. I don't either. Yeah.
And I think leaving the earth behind is a problem, because, as you're going to take the same environmentally destructive habits with you wherever you go. Just because you're on Mars doesn't suddenly mean you're going to be a caretaker of the environment. Suddenly and magically, that's not going to happen. You're going to carry the same prejudices and biases into space colonies, unless you address them first right here on Earth. But the idea that rationality, that there is somehow some transcendent realm waiting for us out there, where nothing ever changes, where there is no death, where there are no bodies, that is a terrifying idea to me, to inhabit that realm. I mean, if you really consider what it would be like to exist solely in such a realm, it doesn't sound like a place that I personally would want to be. And I
feel the same way, and I also feel, looking at the track record of these billionaires, that they got where they are through a kind of pathological drive to succeed and dominate. And if you consider how they've run their businesses, I would assume that I would wind up a disembodied, if it's even possible, which I don't think it is, but disembodied electronic version of myself, subject to endless spam and manipulative things trying to drag my attention this way and that way. It is literally as close to a vision of hell as I can imagine, to live in their world under their control. And by the way, Earth, for all the damage we're doing to it, is still a much nicer place. So I have no idea why anyone would want to do it except them, but they have the power to do it.
Yeah, it's true. And Mars actually, there are a lot of things about the environment, for example, in Mars, that are not particularly hospitable to human beings. There's not enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Right.
And there's been some suggestion from Silicon Valley, we could just nuke it with 10 million nuclear weapons to release the carbon dioxide from the soil. I mean, it's just these really bizarre techno fantasies of how we could manipulate the environment. But yeah, the world that you're talking about, I mean, how these tech billionaires run their businesses really is relevant. I mean, a couple of years ago, we were reading about Amazon and how Bezos's vision of how he wants his workers to exist was quite dystopian. I mean, people were talking about, an almost enslaved kind of existence, and having to work through illnesses, never mind, the birth of a child or the adoption of a child,
No bathroom breaks, and being tracked 24/7 where you are in the plant, and all these absolutely ghastly things that he would like.
What I can't remember whether Bezos himself said this, but people in the company would definitely refer to Darwinian competition as kind of the ethos of the place, which I think is an insult to Darwin. But this kind of vision, again, I think just comes out of a kind of profound alienation and a profound lack of humility, lack of respect and reverence for the other. One thing the ecofeminists tend to do, which I think is a really helpful antidote, is to recognize nature, not only our dependence on nature and the fact that we are embodied in nature, but also kind of a recognition of the profound otherness of nature, that it is not just an anthropomorphized existence. I mean, one thing about the earth is not going away just because we make it inhospitable to ourselves. There may well be other life forms that will take over or could adapt if we make it, when we talk about destroying the earth, we really mean destroying it for our own habitation.
Right.
So a kind of reverence for that, the immensity, the otherness, and the dependency. And I think it's the dependency on nature that, the kind of teenage boy mindset that exists in Silicon Valley doesn't want to admit. And it's an anxiety about a fear of not being in control, and a real anxiety about dependency, which shows up, as you say, in this hyper competitive kind of model of human societies, which just ends up with death and destruction. It's not life affirming. It's not adaptive. It's destructive.
And sometimes the term post-human is used, which means, if you think about it, that the ambition is to end humanity, which I think is something we ought to at least have a conversation about before we embark on doing. And the other piece of it, and you touched on it when you talked about control, that it seems to me, and these space flights are a perfect example on it, a war between two competing visions of society, the hierarchical versus the collaborative. And the idea is that these men, and they're all men, have gotten where they are with a hierarchical. They are in control, they are in charge. If you're Zuckerberg, if you're Bezos, if you're whoever you are, and I know Bezos has stepped down from the CEO title, I'm sure he's still in charge. They're all that kind of person. And so in politics, that's reflected in the left-right split between, I guess that, socialism on one end and Ayn Randian libertarianism on the other end. But basically, it's one that is profoundly anti-democratic. And I know Peter Thiel, who's funded a lot of these guys in their startups, has walked back and retracted, but he, very clearly said that he didn't think a democracy was a good way to run a society. And I think that anti-democratic, anti-collaborative piece, it's to me, that it makes the space race very symbolic of the struggle we face as a species between collaboration and domination. But what do you think?
Yes, I think that's very true. And we are kind of untraining ourselves and removing or overriding our instincts for collaboration. Human beings did not evolve to be lone wolves. We have always existed and thrived because we are part of a group. And this idea that we can exist sort of cut off from other beings in a virtual world, a virtual realm, which is increasingly the society that we're constructing, where you wonder why our mental health is deteriorating and we are becoming more anxious. Our distaste for depending on each other and our distancing from human communities is not making us feel good at all. It's making us feel terrible, as a matter of fact. And I think the pandemic really shines a light on this. These libertarian fantasies that you don't have to depend on anybody, and whatever you do doesn't impact anybody else. The pandemic is giving us a real real-time lesson on that. If you're a libertarian, I don't want to get a vaccine because that's my personal choice. Well, you can kill other people with that choice. Give me liberty and give them death. What kind of a philosophy is that? It's really pathological. And this libertarian fantasy in Silicon Valley comes out, of course, in opposition to any kind of regulation, which is part of why abuses in the workplace happen, and also environmental damage that's created by the business activities of Silicon Valley giants. I mean, one of the reasons why we were so worried about environmental crises is the environmental damage that their business pursuits create. So they are really part of the problem, and their idea of a solution really distracts us, as you said in the beginning, from dealing with the challenges we have right here on Earth, and posits the people that are really damaging our human potential, positing them as saviors. It's really backwards than upside down.
And I guess my thought on that is that their defense, the primary defense that I've heard, is that they are rational thinkers, whereas those who oppose them are emotional, kind of mystical, magical thinkers with fantasies and dreams. And I'm sure they would consider the ecofeminists perfect examples of that. But the fact is, I can't think of any more magical, dreamy, ungrounded in reality thinking than to imagine that we're going to upload ourselves into technology, which science hasn't even dreamed about figuring out how to do, or create artificial consciousnesses in a box, which scientists also have no idea how to do. All the hype aside, I mean, Elon Musk can't even get his cars to cross North Phoenix, and he thinks, he's going to create artificial intelligences. We've already killed enough people trying to prove he can make a car drive, and that's a very rudimentary task. So I guess, my closing thought is that these guys are the daydreamers of all time, pretending to be the rational boys. It's like I'm back in the backyard with my Boy Scout kit and my Boys Life magazines, digging in the ground and thinking I'm exploring Mars.
Yes, I think that's very well put. And I think Valerie Plumwood does a great job with this in the book that I mentioned, Feminism, the Mastery of Nature. It's an illusion of mastery. It's a fantasy. And Plato's idea that there is this separate realm from everything we feel and touch and sense, our embodied reality of matter, that there is this realm that exists out there that we can't see and we can't touch, but it's perfect and unchanging and abstract. And that's the real reality. That is magical thinking. And there might be a take on that from the world of psychiatry as to where that kind of magical thinking comes from. But it's pathological. It denigrates life. It is anti-life. It's sick. Not only is it magical thinking, but it's a sick kind of pathology. So yes, I would agree. But of course, the reversal and the projection is to make those that are actually trying to inhabit the real world that we live in, the magical, airy fairy thinkers. But you and I are not going to let them get away with that.
Absolutely not. And Lynn Parramore, we managed to get through this entire conversation without bringing up the fact that Jeff Bezos's rocket looked like, well,
No,
I mean,
it did. It looked. I mean, it looked like a giant penis.
it did, and even if that was an aerodynamically sound way to design it, I would have given it a second thought if I were Jeff, because it was kind of, what's the word? It was a towel. So we'll have to leave it at that. But Lynn Parramore, cultural theorist and author, great article. I encourage people to find it. I'm going to again look up that headline, What Can Save Us from Jeff Bezos's and Silicon Valley's Planetary Death Wish. Thanks for writing it, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
And thank you for all that you do to make these conversations possible. Thank you very much, Richard.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.